Tonight on the Daily Debrief, a verdict in a so-called love triangle murder case. The defense says there's no evidence of an affair. Also, an appeals court wants to hear the case of the Michigan gymnastics doctor who admitted to sexually assaulting athletes. That's tonight on the Daily Debrief for Monday, December 17th. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Debrief. Glad you're with us this evening. A verdict in the so-called case of a Florida love triangle. Denise Williams has been convicted for helping plan the murder of her husband, Mike Williams. Mike had a friend named Brian Winchester. Winchester testified he was the shooter. He married Denise Williams after her husband, Mike, was out of the way. Mike Williams disappeared on a duck hunting trip in the year 2000. Back then, people thought he possibly drowned and was possibly eaten by alligators. Normally, it takes 5 years for Florida authorities to declare a missing person dead. Denise Williams sought that designation after only 6 months, and she collected her husband's life insurance and Social Security valued at more than $2 million. Co-defendant Brian Winchester wrote some of those policies. The jury convicted Denise Williams on all 3 charges she faced at trial: conspiracy to commit first-degree murder itself, and being an accessory to murder after the fact. Here is the late Friday verdict.
State of Florida versus Denise Williams. We, the jury, find as follows: as to count 1 of the indictment, the defendant is guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. As to count 2, we, the jury, find the defendant is guilty of first-degree murder. We, the jury, find as follows: as to count 3 of the indictment, the defendant is guilty of accessory after the fact of first-degree murder.
Jurors made that decision after about 8 hours of deliberations. Our guest tonight is Marni Snyder. Marni, thanks for being here tonight. I know you were with us late Friday for that verdict. They deliberated quite into the evening after about 8 hours, as I said.
Yeah, they were there really late.
Okay, so your analysis today, having a chance to think about this over the weekend, has hindsight brought any new insights into your mind about perhaps why jurors went this way?
I mean, I think now that a lot had to do with that affair, that they could add 2 motives to Brian Winchester, and it substantiated a motive for the defendant, Ms. Williams, and I think that that's really what got them over the edge. And that, if you think about it, is the missing piece that I didn't have as I watched the trial because we weren't allowed to see that photo.
That could have been the key photo, and look, it's another piece of the puzzle that we didn't get a chance to see that, of course, jurors did. Jurors had some late questions, though. They did want to hear the testimony from Brian Winchester, and upon hearing that it would take too long to put it together, they went back into deliberations, and they came out with a verdict not long after that. Why might that be?
Well, to me, it seemed as though they didn't really have a specific part of his testimony that they wanted, because the judge did offer to read them back certain portions that might be faster for them to listen to. It kind of sounds like they were just doing a check on their verdict to make sure that they had it right. And being that he was the key witness, they figured if they reviewed his testimony in its entirety, they could then fit the other pieces in and make sure that that's the verdict that they wanted to find. But it seemed like that was too much work. Not that they weren't taking it seriously, but I think they were already at the guilty.
It is a possibility. Listen, we might get some more insight from one of the defense attorneys who represented Denise Williams. He reacted to the verdict today on the Law&Crime Network. Here he promises not to give up on behalf of his client.
I think it was a gut punch. It was a gut punch certainly to the entire defense team, and it was devastating news to Denise. Jury had been out about 8 hours, really felt that they had gotten a good understanding of what the facts were and how the law applied, and I think perhaps they just made a more emotional decision than they did a factual decision. You've got to respect the jury process, but at the same time, looking at the evidence in the case, how it was presented, I don't see how there was any other decision other than not guilty as to all 3 counts. In Florida, we have a standard on the motion for new trial that allows the court to weigh the sufficiency of the evidence. And we think that the court in this case, when presented with a proper motion, will look at things in a much more clinical and much more detached fashion, as judges tend to do. And I'm again very very concerned that there was not enough sufficient evidence to sustain a conviction, and I think perhaps the court will agree. When looking at everything in total, the judge may go ahead and tip the scales and say, no, the burden wasn't met, and we'll start over.
The defense also said jurors should not have held the insurance payouts against Denise Williams because she was getting advice from others about them, including Brian Winchester.
It wasn't really Denise's idea to do that. If you recall the testimony from Kurt Hunter and from some others, Denise's father, Mr. Merrill, one of the first people at the scene, if not the first person at the scene of Mike going missing. Marcus Winchester was a family friend and advisor. Brian Winchester at this time was a close friend and advisor. And the advice that Denise received was, you go ahead and you file these claims. I mean, that's what people do in the insurance business. If you recall from Scott Dungy's deposition, he was a very close personal friend. And after 3 or 4 days, most people moved from missing person to body recovery. So 19 days in the grand scheme of things wasn't radically a short period of time given what everyone else was telling her.
The defense also contests whether Denise Williams ever had an affair with Brian Winchester, despite the testimony of Brian Winchester.
No one ever proved an affair. That's an assumption that is made. There's no evidence of an affair. There was absolutely no evidence of an affair put out there in that trial. Kathy Thomas was specific. She did not have an affair with Brian Winchester. Absolutely not. She married him in 2005, but she did not have an affair with him in the 90s. And in fact, the only evidence that was adduced at trial of who Brian Winchester was running around on his wife with was Angela Stafford. I think that people want to criticize the way someone looks and the way they would expect someone to react, but again, everyone grieves differently. Mike went missing, basically, 18 years ago yesterday, but the funeral service for him occurred in February of 2001. I don't think it's fair or responsible to try to suggest that Miss Williams has to continue to cry and emote every single time his name is mentioned for 20, 21, 22, 25 years. I think she suffered. She went through it. She did what was best for her and her daughter, and she made the best of it. Brian Winchester said two things that are true. He's a murderer, and he's a liar. Those two things are true. But look at it this way. Brian Winchester can say anything he wants when there's no corroborative or substantial evidence. He can make up the he said, she said, because just like the government can't prove there was an affair, there's no way that Denise can disprove there wasn't an affair. You can't prove a negative. So if he makes up a story, there's no way for Denise or us to disprove it. I mean, where were the hotel records? Where were the eyewitnesses? Where was the credit card receipts? Where was anything tangible to show that there had been an affair from 1997 to 2000? There was none because it didn't happen. But Brian Winchester can go back in time and cherry pick events knowing full well that no one will ever find anything to contradict him.
So the defense has some serious questions about what happened in this case. Meanwhile, the lead prosecutor appeared less than an hour ago on the Law and Crime Network to defend his immunity deal with Brian Winchester himself.
Until we did the proffer agreement, we didn't even know where Mike Williams was. Brian Winchester gave us the information that led us to the body. At that point, we can determine it's a homicide, which then got the ball rolling, if you will, on the investigation, which allowed us to secure the confidential informant, and then ultimately secure the audio recording that was used in the course during the trial. In watching Brian Winchester tell the story the first time, there really was not a whole lot of doubt that he was lying. It was the way he portrayed it. He quite frankly would deserve an Academy Award if he was lying. But the way he portrayed it left little doubt. But of course, we did our due diligence and went back and tried to corroborate the things that he had said, and were able to do so on many different things, those that could be corroborated.
The prosecutor said he believed his biggest piece of evidence in this case was that recording we heard here on Law and Crime between Denise Williams and the ex-wife of the accused triggerman, Brian Winchester.
That recording was done prior to us going to grand jury, so we knew that whenever we ended.
We seem to have lost that one, folks. Sorry about that. We're going to listen to that same prosecutor during closing arguments last week, where he argued that the confession of triggerman Brian Winchester was corroborated by evidence found with the victim's body, and therefore Winchester was also trustworthy about the involvement of Denise Williams. The motive, the prosecutor said, was the life insurance.
Follow the money. What investigative department says. Homicide investigation, we looked at the spouse. Follow the money. $1 million, $500,000, $250,000, $1.75 million. That she is the beneficiary of. Not Brian Winchester. She. And when you add all that up, each and every element of that conspiracy has been met.
The defense, meanwhile, during closing arguments, opened up a full attack on Brian Winchester himself. And I'm not sure if we have that one either, folks. Okay, we do. Let's go.
Mr. Winchester's a murderer and a liar. And he's in jail. He doesn't like being in jail, and he doesn't want to go to prison. From his own lips, I don't want to go to prison. So what does Mr. Winchester decide to do? Well, what do we know about Mr. Winchester up to this point? He's a planner. He's a salesman. There's one other thing about Mr. Winchester that's relevant at this point. He's already planted evidence before. And forget the hat. Remember the hat? Brian Winchester is out on Lake Seminole riding around with his dad, lying to everybody about what happened, lying about what he knew, lying about what he did. That didn't stop him from planting evidence. He put a hat out there. He planted evidence. So in the summer of 2017, after spending a year in jail and recognizing that his obstruction of justice and witness tampering plans were not going to work, I got nothing else to do. And I'm a planner, I'm a salesman, and I'll obstruct justice. So what do I have to do? I will come up with not a life insurance policy. I am going to come up with a Brian life policy. I am going to come up with a way to not only get out of the serious trouble I'm in, the life felony that I'm looking at with Judge Hankinson, I'm going to give the state something so good, they're going to give me a free pass to murder. They're going to let me get away with it. And as icing on the cake, I get revenge on Denise Williams for turning me into the police.
During his argument, the prosecutor tugged at the jury's heartstrings. Look carefully here at the gold object that's going to be sitting on the railing. To the left, of course, is the courtroom. To the right, the jury, out of view here. That's the victim's wedding ring. It was buried underground with his body for years. The prosecutor wanted to make sure the jury saw it during closing arguments. Marni, Snyder is back to us tonight. So, Marni, Joe, look, that wedding ring had to have carried some pretty serious value to have it sitting there during those closing arguments, despite what the defense was saying. I thought the defense had some strong arguments, but the prosecution carried the day here. And the prosecutor said, look, I had enough evidence to get a conviction here. Of course he did. What's your analysis?
I mean, I personally still have reasonable doubt. I understand why the ring touched people's heartstrings. I mean, this definitely was a case about a marriage that was either happy and didn't need to go to someone being murdered, or was incredibly troubled, and it's very upsetting that someone could do this to their spouse. So obviously that did a nice job playing on their heartstrings. But I just don't see enough of a connection with her to the crime or even the motive. And I'm not sure that I believe this affair either. So for me, it's really troublesome that there was a conviction in this particular case.
The defense wants to file a motion for a new trial here, and if that fails, they want to move forward with other avenues for an appeal. So what's your analysis of how frequently these actually work? Do they have a good shot at that?
Right. Well, that's incredibly difficult, because if they're going to say that the verdict was against the weight of the evidence, then they're really starting to try to retry the case. They need to show what evidence was not credible because of other evidence or should not have been considered because of the law. But the jury is really the one that makes the fact-finding, and it's very hard to overturn a jury's verdict.
The prosecutor is talking all about corroboration this afternoon here on Law and Crime. We were questioning that during the trial. My guess is that one of the key elements of the appeal here is going to be just how much corroboration is necessary for someone like Brian Winchester to get up on the stand and say, Denise Williams was involved with this crime with me, but there's not a lot of corroboration for that specific thing. There's corroboration for other points of his story, but not necessarily that she was there, that she was involved, she was planning it, other than that big phone call that the prosecutor talked about. So is corroboration going to be the real nexus of this appeal?
Probably. I mean, look, testimony, if believed, is evidence. So when someone says there's no evidence that something happened, you need to realize that someone accusing someone verbally after taking the stand and being subject to cross-examination, their testimony is in fact evidence. But what they're saying is that with his, lack of detail, especially with his unreliability because of the cooperation agreements, he should have been believed, and then there's nothing else. And I think that's really important, because there's a lot of litigation right now surrounding people who are cooperators, people who take cooperation deals, and whether they should be relied upon as much by the government in all types of jurisdictions as they are.
Marni, Snyder, we appreciate your insight. We'll check in with you again at the end of the broadcast. Still ahead, though, tonight here on the Daily Debrief, find out why a Michigan appeals court has agreed to take the case of a doctor who admitted to abusing gymnasts for years before he was finally caught. Plus, a television segment about a Green Beret accused of murder has attracted the president's attention. Next, the details on the Daily Debrief. Welcome back to the Debrief, folks. A Green Beret who is charged with killing a man linked to the Taliban may get some personal legal help from President Trump. Major Matthew Golsteyn is charged with murder after admitting to killing a suspected Afghan bomb maker in 2010. President Trump on Twitter said he would review the case after a Fox and Friends television segment examined the matter. Trump said Golsteyn could face the death penalty from our own government after he admitted to killing a terrorist bomb maker while overseas. That's the president's words. A couple from South Carolina in court today after having been convicted on charges related to the disappearance and presumed death of a teenager. A jury convicted Tammy Moorer of kidnapping and conspiracy. She's currently serving a 30-year sentence in that case. Husband Sidney Moorer was sentenced to 10 years for obstruction of justice. The teenager, Heather Elvis, has never been seen or heard from since the date she disappeared. Today, Law and Crime has learned that Sidney and Tammy Moorer were called to court to provide handwriting samples. They're also facing legal issues surrounding false statements on Medicaid forms. Now to another case we're following here on the Law and Crime Network. Jeremiah Monell of New Jersey is accused of stabbing his wife to death and leading police on a manhunt after the crime. Victim Tara O'Shea Watson died in December 2016. Monell rejected a 30-year plea deal and chose to go to trial instead. Jury selection is occurring this week, but the trial will begin after the holidays. If convicted, Monell faces life without parole. A controversial ruling could potentially alter the legal outcome of police shootings in at least one state. The Supreme Court of Florida has ruled that the Sunshine State's Stand Your Ground law does apply to police officers and that they can use it to justify the use of force. The law can provide officers with a potential immunity against further charges. Stand Your Ground makes it possible for those accused of deadly shootings to avoid trial if a court finds certain elements of the shooting were justified. The state Supreme Court's decision stems from the deadly police shooting of a mentally ill computer engineer in 2013. A trial date has been set for a Texas man who has quite an interesting mugshot here. Todrick Eugene Matthews is charged with murder in the death of his girlfriend in 2013. Matthews told police the victim was found submerged in a tub inside his home, which had been set on fire. Matthews, who appears to have decided to be a show-off here, is set to go on trial March 5th of this coming year. The woman who led Michigan State University during the Larry Nassar sex abuse case is due back in court tomorrow. Luanna Simon faces a series of accusations that she lied to police about her knowledge of investigations into Larry Nassar's conduct. A probable cause hearing in her case is scheduled tomorrow. Larry Nassar himself admitted to sexually assaulting a series of gymnasts, including members of the U.S. Olympic team. He's serving back-to-back state and federal sentences. Speaking of Larry Nassar, a high court in Michigan has agreed to hear an appeal based on the conduct of Larry Nassar's judge. Nassar is complaining that Judge Rosemarie Aquilina should not have handled a motion to re-examine her own sentence, which Nassar said was either biased or created the appearance of impropriety. Judge Aquilina sentenced Nassar to between 40 and 175 years in prison and made comments about signing his so-called death warrant. Marni Jo Snyder is back with us one more time here on the Daily Debrief. So, Marni Jo, what do you make of this Larry Nassar situation, this appeal complaining about the judge's conduct during the sentencing hearing?
Well, it sounds like really what they're saying is that they're complaining about her conduct at the sentencing hearing on a motion for resentencing, and therefore it doesn't make sense that she heard the motion for resentencing. So it's kind of a different issue that has those two layers to it.
Yeah, I mean, there's the initial layer, what happened at the hearing itself, and then the complaint that she shouldn't have heard the complaint about the original one. So, look, just because a judge makes a snarky comment at a sentencing hearing or says something that catches attention, does that make it biased? Does that make the judge biased?
No. The defendant is entitled to individualized sentencing, and for the judge not to have predetermined the sentence before she is hearing from the lawyers, reading the reports about the defendant, and all those other things. The judge is not required to be nice to a defendant at a sentencing hearing or not make snarky remarks, or, I mean, not do the math and add up the fact that another 70 years probably means that he will die in prison. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, this went on for a while. We had all the gymnasts testify. Of course, she faced flack for that, but she's the judge, and he pleaded guilty. Marni Jo Snyder, we appreciate you joining us on the Debrief tonight.
Thank you for having me.
That's all the time we have left on the Debrief. Live trial coverage here on the Law&Crime Network, as always, begins tomorrow at 9 o'clock Eastern. I'll see you right here on the Debrief starting at 5 o'clock and ending at 5:30. From all of us at the Law&Crime Network, have a good evening, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.